welcome to Religion Off the Beaten Track with Robin Douglas, a podcast on the lesser-known aspects of religion and belief.
Hello, and welcome to the latest episode of Religion Off the Beaten Track. I'm Robin Douglas, and today I'm joined by Richard Kaczynski of Yale University, author of the book Friendship in Doubt, Aleister Crowley, J.F.C. Fuller, Victor B. Neuburg, and British Agnosticism. Welcome to the show, Richard, and thanks for being with us.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you for inviting me on.
Well, I imagine that a number of our listeners will know you as a biographer of Aleister Crowley. Some years ago, you published a very well-researched biography of Crowley called Perdurabo. Perhaps I could just pause there and ask, is it Crowley or Crowley?
It is Crowley. He's remarked there
Okay.
holy, and there's a few poems where he uses that to good effect.
Right, okay. Well, that solves the mystery then. Anyway, you published Perdurabo a number of years ago, and it's a great monument of research. Perhaps I can start by asking how you first got into researching Crowley's life and career.
Well, I had been interested in Crowley from a very early age, and a number of years later, perhaps 10 years after getting interested in Crowley, I had happened to stumble across a new biography that was released, and it was fairly lurid. It was kind of a rehashing of a lot of the tropes that were just, they're sensational but not accurate. And I remember reading this on the plane on my way home from a holiday trip and thinking, this is terrible. I could do a better job than this. And this little voice in the back of my head said, why don't you? And for some reason, I listened to that voice and spent a number of years just kind of digging into the research, going through archival materials, and for me, trying to set the record straight. One of the things I disliked about most of the biographies at that time were that the author seemed to very frequently interject their opinions and their value judgments on their reader. And I thought that, it's just kind of speaking for myself, but thinking other readers would feel the same way. I wanted to just present the facts and let readers draw their own conclusions, whether they thought the man was interesting or repulsive or something in between, or both.
Indeed. And I guess your current book flows naturally from that biographical research.
It does, in fact. I think the impetus for this book was that one of the things I wanted to write in Perdurabo was talking about how Crowley's early colleagues, J.F.C. Fuller and Victor Neuburg, met through their participation in the agnostic movement. And previous biographers, again, similarly had mentioned that they contributed to the Agnostic Journal. And I wanted to add a footnote where I cited those contributions. And as I looked, I found that nowhere was this list of contributions ever cited or referenced or, listed. So it kind of fell to me to complete this footnote in the book, which is kind of an incidental thing, but nevertheless, I spent several days at the Library of Congress here in the U.S. poring over stacks of the Agnostic Journal and the Freethinker magazine, looking for anything that was written by these three fellows. And to my surprise, I came away with after many visits, I came away with this hefty stack of photocopies of their contributions. And so this allowed me to write my footnote citing all their contributions. But I thought that there's something here. I mean, this was a substantial amount of literature. The Library of Congress was the only place in the U.S. that actually had copies of these journals. So this really early material that all these people had written was just not available. And I thought, there's something here. There's a story behind this agnosticism stuff, but also just the idea of an anthology of this material that had never been available to people on the broader scale. And so, eventually, after Perdurabo was published, I began work on this book.
Okay. And as agnosticism forms the background to the book, perhaps we can go into that. Let me ask, What did agnosticism look like at the time that Crowley was forming his views and interacting with the other characters in the book? People often associate it with what's referred to as the Victorian crisis of faith, the loss of faith in traditional Christianity, and the rise of secular, free-thinking worldviews. What form did agnosticism take in the culture of that time, and how would Crowley have encountered it?
Yeah, well, that's a great point, and I think you're exactly right that the association with agnosticism and free thought does start in the early part of the 19th century with people like Richard Carlile and George Holyoake, the latter of whom coined the term secularism. And it was a natural outgrowth of the Enlightenment, where thinkers were coming to the conclusion that a lot of the laws and policies and just norms of society were based on religious traditions which they viewed as being kind of out of step with Enlightenment values, such as scientific evidence and current understanding of the world. And so you had people like Charles Bradlaugh, for instance, who founded the National Secular Society, the idea of removing religion from the public sphere. And Crowley, Neuburg, and Fuller kind of came into this kind of at the tail end of it after, in the early part of the 20th century. And their encounters came through three main sources. One was George W. Foote, who was the publisher of the Freethinker magazine, which is the longest running free thought journal or agnostic journal in existence, and it's still published to this day. But there was also Charles Alexander Watts. He was the son of Charles Watts, the secretary of the National Secular Society. And Charles Alexander Watts was remarkable because he started the Rationalist Press Association, which was a way of competing with the Society for Promotion of Christian Knowledge, which was popularizing Christianity. Well, not that it needed popularizing, but making it accessible through these inexpensive publications. And he took a gamble, Charles Albert Watts did, saying that readers would also be interested in reading philosophical and scientific publications in the agnostic movement if they were available at an inexpensive price. And this was a big gamble because people thought that the average, person on the street who was going to be buying a paperback booklet for a few pence, was, stereotypically, the worker who was not educated or had an interest in such things. But it proved to be immensely successful and selling like millions of copies. So it was, more widely successful than anyone anticipated. And there was also another publisher of the Agnostic, who went by the pen name Saladin, kind of as a callback to the Muslim leader who opposed King Richard during the Crusades, and in similar way he was opposing Christianity in England at the time. And it was through these two people, Charles Albert Watts and his journal, three people, the Freethinker magazine, and then also the Agnostic journal, that the principals of my book all came to know each other, because they were all young apostates, basically, who came to look for an alternative. And the first gesture of their apostasy, as it were, for both Fuller and Neuburg, was to publish in the Freethinker and the Agnostic journal. And so it is that they came to know each other.
Yeah, it's not always appreciated that there was this whole infrastructure of agnostic and atheist and free-thinking publications and organisations in Victorian England. And people who know about Crowley know that he was born into a fundamentalist Christian family and he was brought up in the Plymouth Brethren sect. But it's not always appreciated that at that time there was already this subculture of agnosticism and atheism, which was there for those who wanted to step into it. And Crowley was clearly reacting against the narrowness of his upbringing. But is it the case that he was reacting against it, not in the direction of occultism, but in the direction of this semi-respectable, semi-mainstream, free-thinking culture?
It kind of goes a little bit of both ways because a lot of his, he went through his phase where he became involved in occultism through the Order of the Golden Dawn, which was the preeminent occult society at that time that included, thinkers like, the actress Florence Farr and the poet William Butler Yeats and so on. But he became disaffected with that and came to view himself more as an atheist and clinging toward a Buddhist philosophy. And it was at this point that he began to adhere to this more agnostic and free thought sort of path. And then a few years later, kind of shifted back toward an appreciation of the occultism for which he is best known. But in that shift carried with him a lot of what he had learned through his participation in the agnostic movement. And that's kind of what the book I've written is about.
So he's a kind of seeker. He knows what he's rejecting, but he takes some time to find a positive alternative to it.
Correct. And that winds up being the case with both Neuburg and Fuller as well. Neuburg was raised in a very traditional Jewish family, and he, being a very sensitive young man while he was still in grade school, had already converted to vegetarianism, and his first poem published in the Freethinker was called Wale Yehovah, basically saying, goodbye to his Jewish faith and pursuing this free thought path, which he had discovered by passing, a bookseller and finding a copy of the Freethinker. And J.F.C. Fuller, in many ways, his story parallels Crowley's in that his father was a very religious man and a bit of a preacher as well. And Fuller, while stationed in the army, was reading a lot of books on philosophy, alternative religions, reading basically about Hinduism at a time and yoga at a time when it was not really well understood in the West. And similarly, winds up writing a screed to the Agnostic Journal complaining about compulsory church attendance as part of the military service and calling for its abolition, and making a point of writing home to his mother saying, please don't let my dad see this, because he was still very much under the shadow of his, very religious father figure, but similarly kind of rebelling against that very strict religion in which he was raised as well.
Yeah. It's worth taking a moment to look at Fuller and Neuburg more closely, because Crowley is a fairly well-known figure. He'll probably be known to the people who are listening to this. But Neuburg is less so, and Fuller definitely less so. Fuller was a soldier, wasn't he? And Neuburg was a poet, and Crowley's lover for a period. And you say that Fuller emerged from the same narrow Christian background that Crowley did.
Yeah, I mean, he wasn't his family was not a member of the Plymouth Brethren, but it was nevertheless, a very religious and very strict sort of household. So in many ways, they were responding, and rejecting against, rebelling against their religious upbringing in similar ways.
And Fuller clearly fell into Aleister Crowley's circle, and he wrote a very flattering essay about his work, didn't he, called The Star in the West?
Correct, and that has a big part of how they came together because Crowley began publishing. Well, let me back up a little bit. Crowley joined the Rationalist Press Association, which is kind of a sort of book of the month club that was offered by Charles Watts, publisher. And through this, Crowley actually came to have a couple of his books published through Watts. And when Crowley broke from that circle and decided to kind of follow Watts's example of the cheap reprint series that Crowley started his own publishing company, very cheekily called the Society for Promotion of Religious Truth, similar in style to the Society for Promotion of Christian Knowledge. But he started publishing his own books, kind of taking the leaf from Albert Watts, and held a contest for the best essay on his collected works, which in and of itself was kind of remarkable. So Crowley was 30 years of age and already publishing a 3-volume edition of his collected works, which is something to say. And Fuller, reading about this through the Agnostic Journal and the Rationalist Press Association, decided to contribute an essay, and it turned out to be the only contribution to this contest. So Fuller, won the competition and had his book published. But yes, it was a book called The Star in the West, and it was an essay on Crowley's works, speaking very flatteringly of him, as you would expect for a contest entry. But it wasn't just idle flattery that Fuller very much became under Crowley's spell in terms of being fascinated and drawn in by the occultism that Crowley at this point had kind of returned to. And you do see this, interestingly enough, in Crowley and Fuller's contributions to the Agnostic Journal, because they start off with being this very hostile, very polemic, anti-Christian sort of stuff, which formed the backbone of a lot of this literature. But suddenly Fuller starts writing poetry with all this occult symbolism and footnotes referring to the Kabbalah and things like that. And this is all like shortly after meeting Crowley, so he's like done this very dramatic shift, in tone after they became acquainted with each other.
Yeah, it's interesting. Crowley and Fuller and Neuburg clearly ended up becoming full-blown occultists, but it's apparent from your work that it was agnosticism that brought them together, and they would never have gone in the direction they did if it hadn't been for their involvement in that very rationalist secular subculture.
Right, and I think that's the value of having the second half of the book, which is the anthology of her writings, which so what makes that valuable is that we kind of know the later life story of like Neuburg and Fuller and of course Crowley, but being able to see these early works from particularly Neuburg and Fuller, that you kind of get to get a better sense of their trajectory intellectually and spiritually. Fuller in particular is someone whose occult origins has kind of been downplayed by his biographers. And I think being able to see his starting point in agnosticism and where he goes from there, is potentially very useful to future scholars of, any of these, three principles of my book.
Yeah, and one thing that comes across is that the influences that acted on these men began to act on them quite early in life, and indeed before they became adults. And adulthood would have come at 21 at that time. They were evidently already being influenced in unorthodox ways by the time they were students. If we take Victor Neuburg, he rejected his Jewish background in favour of becoming involved with the Cambridge University Pan Society, which is quite surprising. And Crowley likewise had a tutor at Cambridge who is quite well known for being a classic Victorian rationalist, Arthur Verrall. So before they reached adulthood, these men were already being influenced in these unorthodox directions.
Correct. And in many ways, that was kind of the typical model for the new agnostics in the latter part of the movement, at the end of the 18th or 19th century, going into the 20th century, that the idea of these disaffected, young, semi-affluent people who are kind of impressionable and open and seeking, to kind of break from their family traditions was, a primary audience of the new agnostic movement. So they kind of fit that mold, but went off in a rather unexpected trajectory.
Yeah, and the Pan Society, that's a pretty unorthodox enterprise, isn't it?
Yeah, and a lot of that was intended to create a platform to Crowley to come back to his alma mater, Cambridge, and to give lectures on occultism and magic and things like that, and potentially to, again, recruit, young college-educated persons into, his tradition, which was this more magically focused approach.
And an unusual feature of the Cambridge University Pan Society is that people in that society became involved, didn't they, with the university's Free Thought Association. So there was a permeable barrier between pagan occult activities and the dry, rationalist, secular subculture.
Yeah, and then that's an interesting thing I noticed with some of these journals while flipping through them. That, while I was looking primarily for articles about Crowley and Fuller, and Neuburg, or written by them. There were also articles about people like Annie Besant, who had come from the free thought movement as an advocate of contraception and things like that, and who actually got into some legal trouble for that early advocacy, but then moved on to become a theosophist. And there's writers about visiting yogis, from the East, coming to Europe. And also a lot of writers who wrote about these new sorts of anthropological interpretations of ancient religions, whether it be J.G. Frazier's The Golden Bough, or some of the other phallicists, or Robertson's book on pagan Christs, trying to argue that Christianity actually has borrowed tropes from older pagan traditions and kind of erased the serial numbers, as it were, and repackaged these older ideas. And so all of these sorts of alternative sorts of approaches to religion were very much fair game in this literature. So it wasn't so much they were eschewing religion or spirituality altogether necessarily, but they were kind of eschewing the dominant forms of religion and spirituality, and kind of trying to open the door to at least consider some of these other writers and thinkers.
Yeah, yeah. To focus back on Crowley again, it's clear that he was influenced by the agnostic movement. You argue that this was the case in his publication, The Equinox, in his order, the AA, in the concept of scientific illuminism. How great was the debt that he owed to the agnostic movement?
Well, I think it's something that hasn't really been appreciated, but I think if you kind of line up the agnostic ideals and the way these groups kind of promulgated their ideas alongside Crowley's attempts to do the same, you see some definite parallels. And I think it's reasonable to argue that Crowley, having seen this model, in his association with the agnostic movement, kind of carried this over. So, for instance, this idea of approaching one's worldview from an evidence-based standpoint is one that he applied to the practice of occultism through what this idea that he termed scientific illuminism. And his famous definition years later, he wrote, of magic as the art and science of causing change to occur in conformity with will, that he incorporates this idea of science and the idea that you try things and you stick with what you can demonstrate works. And so he's an advocate of keeping detailed records of one's experiments, so that we can go back and evaluate the success or failure of each and determine what method works best for each individual. The sort of motto of the Equinox, his publication, where he first introduces these concepts of scientific illuminism, also had the motto of, the method of science, the aim of religion. But initially, when William Stewart Ross, who was the fellow I mentioned earlier, who went by the pen name Saladin, when he died in like 1907, this was early on in the association of these three people, Crowley, Neuburg, and Fuller. Crowley actually had the idea of buying the Agnostic Journal and using it as a vehicle for his group's sort of collective thoughts. And the widow was not interested in selling, so he launches his own journal, the Equinox. That again is kind of paralleling this whole, they had a journal, we should have a journal. The idea that, Watts and company was publishing this cheap reprint series to great success. Crowley had this back stock of books. They weren't really selling well. He just had like a warehouse full of books just kind of sitting there. He had inherited a fortune and spent recklessly, one might say, to release his books in really nice bindings. And he thought, well, maybe my books would sell better if they were published more cheaply. And so he again started this cheap reprint series through his publishing company. So in many ways, there are these parallels between the agnostic and the free thought movements and then what Crowley went on to do. And again, as you mentioned, the idea that the Cambridge University Free Thought Association had this permeable barrier between free thinking and more pagan ideas was all part of that as well.
Yeah, yeah. And it's interesting to think that if Crowley's planned purchase of the Agnostic Journal had gone through, the things that he ended up publishing in the Equinox about occultism, esotericism, and so on might have ended up reaching the public under an explicit agnostic label, which seems pretty bizarre to us today.
Yeah, and I don't know that it would have worked, so it's perhaps just as well, although the Agnostic Journal wound up folding for financial reasons shortly thereafter. But there came a breaking point between Crowley and the agnostics because he was going off in this more and more occult sort of direction that was increasingly less palatable. And so in Watt's publication, magazine, the Literary Journal and Agnostic Review, reviews of Crowley's works, which were initially very friendly and laudatory, became increasingly critical, and it kind of led to this sort of war of scathing reviews in each other's journals over it. That Crowley felt this sort of rejection from this movement that he was a part of, but at the same time he was moving away, and I think there was this mutual recognition that there was a parting of the ways. But even so, Crowley later on, sent a copy of his collected works to G.W. Foote saying, hey, if you see anything in here you want to republish, go ahead. And this was after this sort of contentious break. So Crowley never completely broke, or he kind of kept that door open, even despite some of these hostile back and forths in the review sections of their magazines.
Yeah, I think I'm right in saying that Foote was the second to last person in English legal history to be convicted in the courts of blasphemy. Perhaps Crowley would have approved of that.
Yeah. In fact, around the time that Crowley's association with both Fuller and Neuburg began to disintegrate, that kind of centered around this performance of a series of 7 plays called The Rites of Eleusis that happened at Caxton Hall in successive Wednesdays, one for each of the 7 planets of traditional astrology. And the Yellow Press, the Looking Glass and journals like that, John Bull and so on, tried to institute basically a moral panic over these plays, saying that Crowley and company were trying to introduce a new form of paganism to England. And so a series of really sensational articles followed, which prompted Crowley to actually write an essay for The Bystander under the title of Concerning Blasphemy in General and the Rites of Eleusis in particular, where he actually tried to fend off these charges of blasphemy. So absolutely in that sense, Crowley and Foote, but also some of the other agnostics who similarly were jailed for blasphemy, certainly had common cause.
Yeah, yeah, and one question that arises with all this is that if Crowley hadn't had these agnostic, free-thinking influences, how different would his work have looked? One example that comes to mind is his statement that spirits are portions of the human brain, which seems to come directly from Victorian rationalism. If Crowley hadn't been involved with rationalism, how different would his ideas have looked, and how different would Thelema look today?
That's a good question. I think it's a little hard to know for sure. I do think that Crowley's thinking on things certainly evolved over the years. So the essay that you wrote, where he talks about the demons of the Goetia actually being parts of one's own psyche, was written rather early on, and he seemed to fluctuate on these ideas and these conceptions of whether the spirits one was working with were actually projections of one's mind or whether they had some external reality. And in his own experience, he was the recipient of various, well, and I guess what we'd call today channeled or inspired documents that contained information that he believed he did not possess and therefore must have come from some source external from him. After many years, other people provided answers or unlocked some of the keys to understanding these documents. So I think in some ways, as Crowley's work went on, while he retained some of those rationalist and scientific trappings to the very end, including this whole idea of approaching the practice of magic in a very methodical and scientific way. I think some of his thinking as well kind of evolved away from the rationalist stuff. So it's a little bit of both. Crowley certainly hung on to this idea that magic could be scientific. His Gnostic Mass, one of the rituals that he wrote, contains a creed, which, even though it's in this very mystical sort of language, the idea behind them were words that he felt that a man of science could say in confidence. They talk about our Lord and Father, the Sun, the creator of all life or whatever, but at the same time, he's saying, well, yes, the sun literally is the source of light on the earth through which we all live. I mean, without the sun, there would, we'd be dead. So this idea that he wanted to keep the scientific element in his magic never went away. So presumably he might have been more mystically minded. But I think even in his later years when he worked with Frida Lady Harris to develop the Thoth Tarot, he also was very careful to interject elements of magic, of science into those cards as well. So in some of the cards you see, the table of elements popularized by J.W.N. Sullivan, the science and mathematics popularizer of the 1940s, or Mobius solids and projective geometry and things like that. So, yeah, it's kind of hard to imagine Crowley without the rationalist piece, because I think that's kind of what makes him kind of unique. Even though, a lot of the writers of that time kind of claim occultism to be a kind of science, and a lot of the yogis also said the same thing was kind of a spiritual science. Crowley actually tried to bridge that gap between calling that science, but the actual practice of science and the skepticism and the methodical approach that comes with it.
Yeah, yeah. And if we step back from Crowley personally, the picture that emerges from your research is one that challenges the usual narrative of the occult revival. Because it's often said, and I've said it myself, that the occult revival was reacting against secular modernity and trying to re-enchant the world with a mystical, magical worldview. But it looks like you've developed a model in which occultism and secularism marched hand in hand.
Yeah, I like that. I think that I've seen some articles over the years, and recently in particular too, talking about how occultism and witchcraft, which is something that's become very popular in recent years again, as it does cyclically. People arguing that it's like this puzzling embrace of the irrational, and it isn't necessarily that. One can embrace these ideas in a very rational way. This kind of takes me back to my own doctoral dissertation in psychology, in graduate school studying psychology, but also interested very much in this idea of these alternative spiritualities. And a lot of the research at that time, and continues to this day, is steeped in this idea called the marginality hypothesis, that people adhere to these beliefs that the mainstream would consider to be irrational or provably false or ridiculous, because they're from marginalized groups, meaning they don't have very good education, that they may not have the same opportunities. And oftentimes minorities, people of color and women are kind of lumped into this marginalized group. And it seemed to me a rather offensive sort of position to start from. And in my own research, I was surveying people who were behaviorally committed rather than just asking college students what they thought. I was talking to people who were actual practitioners who were going to conventions or conferences and camping events and things like that. And I was asking, about them and what they believed. And at least from the research I did, it just turned out that these people were actually very well educated and very rational. And the thing that kind of set them apart was not this lack of rationality, but it was this openness, this questing, searching for new truths rather than feeling everything I need to know is in this book that I was given as a child. So I think that kind of speaks to the point you were making earlier too, about how this occultism and rationality can actually go hand in hand.
Yeah, And speaking of practitioners, the question arises of whether modern-day occultists and esotericists should embrace a rationalist, agnostic self-definition. People in the community often don't seem to be interested in doing that. But would you say that they ought to be open to defining themselves as rationalists, skeptics, agnostics, and so on?
Yeah, I think so. If nothing else, this scientific illuminism idea of Crowley's promotes this idea of critical thinking, and I think that's something that oftentimes is lacking in our modern society. That people are very quick to pick up the latest rumor, conspiracy, and then you actually wind up seeing conspiracy theories kind of seeping into modern occultism. And if people kind of took the time to actually think rationally about some of these issues, they'd be less likely to be drawn into some of these dark corners. And again, I think rationality is a great way to kind of look at one's work as well. I mean, I think whatever one may believe, it's good to be able to kind of step back. I like to think that with my own personal beliefs or practices, whatever they may be, that I'm still able to kind of step back and see the humor in it and kind of joke about it, not in a deprecating sort of way, but to just have this sort of objective view and this awareness that it is different from perhaps what other people might find typical, and just appreciate those differences. And I think that part of that also comes with critical thinking.
Yeah, and perhaps what we have here is a model for being a rationalist that doesn't turn you into a Reddit atheist or a Sam Harris person or that kind of thing.
Yeah. I think that also kind of ties into my background. So these ideas sit very comfortably with me because professionally I work as a statistician, and the way statistics works is you can find proof and you can find evidence, but any mathematical solution you can get a p-value. But what that p-value means is that we're certain to that degree of confidence that this is true. But there's always a possibility, regardless of what decision you make, that could be wrong. The idea that we can be fairly certain, but we can never be 100% certain requires finding some comfort with living with uncertainty. And I think in some of this occult practice, there may be this question of, are these entities that we're encountering, are they parts of our mind? Do they have an objective reality? Is there a God? There's a point in which it doesn't matter. I mean, it's kind of like if I'm doing certain practices and I'm getting results, and it's, if my ideal is to grow as a human being or to become in better touch with myself and understand myself better to, and live life to the fullest, it doesn't matter, what the truth is. What matters is the results. And I don't know that it seems that there are people out there who are more or less comfortable with the idea of uncertainty than I am. And yeah, no, I think uncertainty is a good thing.
Indeed, indeed. And that, I think, is a good note on which to end. I think it's a note that Crowley would have approved of at least. Thank you very much, Richard Kaczynski, for joining us to talk about your book and for sharing your thoughts with us today. I think there's a lot of food for thought there for us to chew on.
Well, thank you for having me on. It was a pleasure.